All right, this mini lecture accompanies the chapter 13 readings, and what we're going to do is talk about evolution and natural selection and the evidence that supports evolution. Okay, and so here are the two guys that came up at the same time, working independently, came up with the same idea, evolution by natural selection. The guy on the left there, that's Charles Darwin with the white beard. The guy on the right is Alfred Russel Wallace. People hear much less about him, but he had the same ideas. A much younger man, but had also good evidence. And evolution is one of the foundational theories of biology. And a theory means that it explains all the existing observations, makes testable predictions, and is supported by new evidence. And the reason these guys both came up with it at the same time is they were dealing with the common ideas that were first put forward by Aristotle. The idea that species were fixed, that there were specific types, and these things were like in stone. And that was based on Aristotle's math ideas of ideals. And so they were both dealing with the problems in Aristotle's idea of species, and so we're looking for answers. And so Wallace, in particular, both of these guys really were using the same evidence and dealing with the same kind of things. Wallace is much lesser known. Your book has a nice description of Darwin, but Wallace, another Englishman who was also traveling the world and looking at different species in different areas. And he was dealing with questions like, why are there so many species? Why do each island that I visit have different species? And why do the islands have similar species but different ones? And why do similar habitats in different places have different things? And so he was a commercial collector of specimens. He would collect butterflies, birds, plants, and he would preserve them and send them back to England to sell to wealthy Victorian collectors. And he noticed that there was all this variation, that he was trying to match the idea of a type specimen. The British Museum usually held the type specimen, which was an Aristotle idea, and so perfect specimens should be just like that. And he quickly realized that all the specimens varied. Even if you looked at the type specimen from two different museums, they wouldn't be the same if you looked at them closely enough. And so what could explain all this variation, and why did we have these different patterns of species? What they came up with was the idea of evolution, that evolution were changes in populations, genetic changes that occur over time, and that led to new adaptations and new species. And this was historical. And so once species were on islands, separate islands have populations likely to go separate ways, and so they'd look different over time. And then the mechanism that they proposed that this happened by was natural selection, was that some individuals would have genes that would lead them to leave more offspring, and those genes would become more common. And so some were more successful, and since you had successful genes would lead to changes in populations. And so, the really question in biology is, what is the evidence that supports this? And I'm going to go over 4 or 5 different types of evidence, and it's important to understand that there's lots of evidence supporting evolution. One type of evidence I've already talked about that was well known to both Darwin and Wallace was artificial selection, that humans could change domestic animals by selecting desirable traits. And so they could produce new breeds of dogs, new breeds of horses, of cows, of cats. They could breed plants. They could breed cattle. And by just choosing which animals reproduced, you could capitalize on natural variation to produce new breeds. Okay, we're well aware of this. Agriculture is, the biggest example of this is agriculture. We select plants to become more productive. In agriculture, corn is one of the greatest successes of this. The ears of corn are huge compared to the ears of corn that we see from Native Americans. That's maize primitive there. And then the wild relative of corn, which is called teosinte. And corn has also been selected for oil content, starch yield, and things like that. Another type of evidence that they were well aware of was the fossil record. Okay, there were fossils of organisms that were different than living organisms. No living organism resembled them, and the older those fossils were, the less like living fossil or living animals or plants they are, and that the oldest fossils were the least simple. And so the oldest fossils were things like bacteria. The true animals first showed up in marine places. The first organisms on land were plants. And among the last organisms were the most complex ones, vertebrates, particularly birds and animals. This fossil you see here is Archaeopteryx, and it's kind of similar to a modern bird, but it's kind of an intermediate. It has a bony tail. No bird has a bony tail, but it's got feathers like a bird. Unlike a bird, it's got teeth in its jaw. Its chest is not fused together, so it has some reptile and it has some bird-like features. The fossil record also shows that there's plenty of time for evolution to occur. We know just by looking at tree ring data, the Earth has got to be old. And we can find places where annual settlements have been laid down for thousands of years. And we can also use radioactive decay, showing the decay where the radioactive elements give off particles and change into other elements at steady rates. And so using radioactive decay, which decays at a steady rate, we can identify that the Earth is very, very old. And so there's plenty of time for evolution. Okay, Darwin and Wallace, one of their big concerns was something called biogeography, the distribution of plants and animals. They were dealing with very specific questions. Why are there so many species? Why do islands have fewer species than equivalent areas on a mainland? Although islands have fewer species, they have many unusual ones, endemic species, species found nowhere else, unusual species, flightless birds. And even though islands have these species, the species on an island usually resemble the nearest mainland, but are somewhat different. Well, for Darwin and Wallace, the easiest explanation is that birds from a mainland came to the island and got stuck there. Because the island was different than the mainland, there were changes that typically occurred in birds that reached islands. Often they became flightless. And that was an easy thing. There were no predators. It's expensive to keep up developing large wings and heavy breast muscles. And so we see the same thing over and over at many different islands. Pelicans, petrels, rails, grebes, ducks. These birds become flightless when they reach islands. Among the best known ones are the dodo bird on the right there from the island of Mauritius, and then the Campbell Island teal, related to a green winged teal, but again a flightless bird. Okay, another important idea that links evolution to species is the idea of homology. That structures are similar based on common ancestors, so they have a similarity in anatomy, and we compare how those structures develop in embryos, so comparative anatomy and comparative embryology. And an example of this is all vertebrates. They are similar early and become more and more different as they develop. They all develop embryos that have pouches, little slits in their throat region. In fishes, these will become the gills. In humans, these will become a series of glands and ducts. Even more similar are the structures of the limbs. They all have the same pattern of bone formation, one upper bone in the limb, two lower bones, and then a series of bones that branch out to as many as 7 in the fingers. And when you look at the limbs of a human, a cat, a bat, or even a porpoise and a horse, these develop in the embryo the same way, and the same genes are active. Okay, And so we can look at them. Even more examples of them are things like pterodactyls, birds, bats, and humans. And these are all suggestions that the only logical conclusion is that they came from a common ancestor, okay? And as they diverged, there was change, that there were variations that were favored. These things accumulated over time, and this led to new species and new evolutionary adaptations. Okay. We also see structures of that organisms got rid of. These are called vestigial structures, like the hip bones in whales, which have no hips or lower limbs, the appendix in humans, the little nubs here that appear in some snakes and sometimes appear as legs, and many, many other more examples. The molecular record is another thing. We can even look at the structure of molecules, proteins, DNA structures, and we can compare them, and we can see, oh yeah, lots of organisms have hemoglobin. It carries oxygen in all these organisms. It has many, many amino acids, and it's just slightly different in each organism. And so this allows us to develop molecular clocks and evolutionary trees showing which organisms have the closest structures. Okay, in summary, science evaluates idea with evidence. And for evolution, it's an idea that genetic change occurs, that species are not fixed, populations change over time, and so there can be new evolutionary adaptations. Okay, we'll talk more about natural selection next time. And I've gone over several different types of evidence: artificial selection, the fossil record, biogeography, similarities in anatomy and embryology, which we'll call homology, and the molecular record.